what I'll do for the first half, I'm going to talk quite loosely and informally. I'm just going to talk to the slides. And then I'll, as I move into kind of heavier stuff, I'll go to reading the paper. So the first section today is quite boring, so try not to switch off, but kind of explaining to you the chronotopic cartographies project and how we do it, what we're doing, just giving you the basic idea, because otherwise when I get to the maps, you can't really understand the maps. Maps obviously won't be that readable on the screen, but the website will come up in a minute. So again, if you get bored, go off on the website and you can zoom right in on the maps there. So part 1, I'll speak really informally, and then parts 2 and 3 it will be more of a read paper. So the chronotopic cartographies project was a major £1 million project from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It had 3 researchers working with me, a linguist, a kind of technical guy, but who is also quite literary actually, and another literary scholar like myself, Becca, who also now works on the Holmes project that I'll talk about tomorrow. There's a major website with lots of information on it, and that's your link there. But basically, if you go Lancaster chronotopic cartographies, it should come up. And there are, actually, we did make all the tools. They are all on GitHub. There's like a training session on GitHub. My one slight reservation is the one thing we didn't do, which I wanted to do, but we just ran out of time and effort, I guess, was to make a really good user interface. We didn't really get that far. So it's quite clunky. The method is clunky and not ideal. I'm hoping to upgrade it, but I've got to get the money to do it. So the kind of core problem, if you like, or the core issue that we were addressing in the project was how to move beyond thinking about literary mapping as only or always mapping onto the real. So prior to this project, in the world, all the well-known literary mapping models always mapped referentially. They always mapped to the real world. And that had always seemed to me very problematic in various ways. So for one thing, that assumes a direct correspondence between the fictional, or the imaginary, and the real, which I have problems with. But also, that can never be, fundamentally, that could never be a universal model because it couldn't cover the whole of literature. So it's immediately, it's flawed from the get-go. So I thought, well, we need to find a way to map that will allow us to map not just texts that have the real in them, questionably, but also purely imaginary worlds. Because if you're not doing that, how much of literature are you not looking at all? So that was the core kind of problem that we were seeking to address. I wanted to use digital tools to generate the map directly out of the text itself. So it was very important to me to feel that this is literally a map of the text. I mean, of course, it's a network, it's a topology really, but actually it is literally mapping out the text. And I wanted that authenticity to be there. Obviously, we were trying to create a new model, which I think we kind of have done. And we were trying to think spatially rather than in terms of genre or history. So in a way, maybe this might be interesting to you as well. So on the page, as it is, if you go to the site, we have different groupings of texts. So it was a scoping out project. It wasn't, so we actually ranged much more widely than I normally would. We had texts from all periods, mostly British, because we wanted to create a universal model. So we wanted to be, will it work for any kind of literature from any period? I wanted to free us from always thinking in terms of period or genre for a text. So that's why we had the groupings. The groupings are not perfect, but they kind of do the job for now anyway. So correspondent places would be any text where, essentially realist text where there appears to be a real, Oliver Twist, London, for example. Indefinite spaces is where the text registers, a hill, a valley, a river, but you don't know where you are. And often, very quickly, we saw our poetry is often an indefinite space, more poetic form often in that section. Nested worlds is really kind of, I guess, a particular trope of realism. So realism is often nested. You know, Jane Austen puts Mansfield Park, you know, they go to Bath, they go to Bristol, and Mansfield Park is sort of nested in there with a kind of anchor points to the real. Fantastic worlds, pure fantasy. Also in there, we had another category that we merged into fantasy, which was bridge worlds, which is quite interesting though. So a lot of children's literature will start in the real, go into the fantasy world, and then return to the real. So we quite often get this bridge into Narnia is a great example of that. So fantasy, pure fantasy, and then the final grouping is a bit strange, but also I think quite interesting. Spaces of exile, so places that either did exist and no longer exist, or that you can't return to, that you want to return to but you can't. So that's quite an important. So what we're trying to do is think about text spatially, purely spatially, and not in terms of genre. So as the title suggests, of course, the kind of core underpinning was the Bakhtinian concept of the chronotope. And he gives us a great definition. We will give the name chronotope, literally time-space, to the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature. So Bakhtin's essay, Forms of Time of the Chronotope, way ahead of its time, slightly weirdly overlooked historically in a way. I think the full potential of the chronotope hasn't been developed, partly to do with when it came out. We've moved from history from time to space. So I think, it's a brilliant essay, and it's an essay which is very, Bakhtin's so literary. His interest really is in literary place and space, and for him, he's saying the chronotope, in a sense, is what makes literature literature. The way in which time and space are connected in literature is a defining core of it. So that was very useful to me. It is a cheat, so I should say that from the get-go. We were originally going to try and map time and space separately, very, very early on, and time is just so difficult that, in a way, the chronotope is a cheat because it combines time and space. So it's like, but it's sort of more spatial than temporal, really. So it's not ideal, and at the end I'll say, well, I know what we should do next, but no one will give me money to do it. So there we go. So his second comment, I love this comment because to me it sort of anticipates the project. Obviously Bakhtin's writing sort of early, mid-20th century. None of the tools that we have are even dreamed of, but it's a great kind of visionary statement. We cannot help but be strongly impressed by the representational importance of the chronotope. Time becomes, in effect, palpable and visible. An event can be communicated. It becomes information. One can give precise data on the place and time of its occurrence. So this was very striking to me because, of course, we're kind of literally visualizing those chronotopes. And he's sort of anticipating that, I think, in some ways. So in his essay, right at the end, actually, he has concluding remarks, which is a really important part of the essay, where Bakhtin sort of outlines, for him, the core chronotopes of literature. And for him, those six are the road, the castle, the parlour, provincial town, threshold, public square. So when we created a kind of table of chronotopes, and we stuck with his chronotopic categories. So again, when I presented in Norway, they're like, this sounds very 19th century, parlour, provincial town. Yes, it does. It does, no question about it. But I just thought, I want to stay true to Bakhtin. I want to acknowledge him fully. And so we deliberately use those terms. However, as you can see, the point of the table is to clarify, well, what does that mean? A castle is not literally a castle, it could be, but actually it stands for, a spatio-temporal form in which you are imprisoned in stasis, discomfort, whatever. A road, particularly, a river, the river in Huckleberry Finn is a road. It's a path, a journey, a travel. So that's why we did this, we used his terms. We added distortion and meta-narrative, because those weren't in Bakhtin, and we were like, well, we definitely need those. Distortion is not ideal, because there's so much distortion. In a way, we could have done with memory, dream. We could have done with different types of distortion. But anyway, it's there. It could have been more defined. And meta-narrative is allowing us to show where the text references are the text, which we thought was really important as well, spatially. Okay, so when you see the visualization in a minute, what you're seeing is the chronotopes chunking out of the text in terms of chronotopic shifts, which is going to form the nodes of the map. And then there's like how are you moving from one chronotopic space to another, you know, how from the castle to the road. And so we have these different connections. In a way, all you need to remember when you see the later visualizations is sort of purple it's actually happening within the text. You know, they're walking there, or they can see something, direct or indirect. And orange is often internal. So it's often happening in the mind rather than in reality, essentially. And green, we'll see a bit of green, it doesn't show up very well on here, which is any kind of paratextual, metatextual. So 3 main colors, and that's just showing different ways in which the text moves from one chronotope to another. Okay, so we created our own spatial schema, and I should say we did do everything manually, so that's something we can discuss. I was saying earlier to Veronique that it was quite. We learned very, very early that the chronotopic, marking up the chronotope is a very subjective experience. How do you decide which chronotope it is? Some of the chronotopes are very ambiguous, like threshold. Is it a threshold? Is it an encounter? You meet someone on a threshold, which is it? And we just embraced that because we realized you can't really do this without it being quite a subjective process. I mean, you could, obviously, you probably could mingle, you could have a hybrid, you could have some natural language processing in there, but anyway, we kept it manual for now. So the node is a place in the text, a location in the text, and it has 2 identities, a chronotopic type. So this is from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So the topos name is harbour, it starts in the harbour, and in this case, it's provincial town. That's the chronotopic type of that place, okay? The connection, in this case, it's connecting a previous block of text to the next, and it's a jump. Or in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the Ancient Mariner is telling a story, and then you go into the story, and then you jump back. There's a lot of jumps, actually, in the rhyme. And then this sort of subcategory is place naming within the region. And the reason we did this is because place naming models are quite crude. So you might have, if you had a standard automated place naming for, say, I don't know, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, it might suddenly have India or whatever, but it doesn't signal, well, she mentions that, when I was in India. It's not actually here now. She's not. So we want to distinguish between place names that are active, that are in play for where you are, and place names that are less direct, and so on. Sort of start to distinguish between different kinds of place naming. This category, because the project was purely spatial, we just used place names. But in theory, you could map anything within a node. You don't only have to map. You'd still probably want to map the topographs, but you could also be mapping for, I think, things like agency. I'm very interested. I really want to map agency, or affect. There's no reason why you couldn't have other categories within the node. Actually, you could map anything. We didn't exploit that because we, again, ran out of time and money. So very crudely put, this is just to show you the process. It's fairly standard. So mark up the text. We put it into, we convert it into visualization files. We have a crude visualization in black and white, and then we kind of have the final visualization showing the full colors and everything. As I say, it is clunky. It's not perfect. We could do better, but it does do the job. So to show you, you understand kind of how the bits are coming together, this is the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, first version. It's quite a short poem, so this is the whole map, so it's actually quite readable. So you can see the purple lines are showing where the characters are traveling. It's quite obvious. They start at the harbour, go to the North Atlantic, whatever. The wedding is the site where the story is being told, and so you've got these orange jumps because he's jumping to the place and then jumping back to the wedding where he's talking to the guy and then jumping back to the place. And then you've got some topographs off the harbour as well. So you can get kind of the idea. And so the images are showing you, you know, the harbour. If you know your chronotopic types by now, which you won't because you've only seen them once, the harbour is a provincial town. It's telling you that because it's the little key. Yeah? So, just to complicate things further, when we code up the text, it doesn't generate a single map. It generates a series of maps from the same code. And what those maps do is privilege different information. It's actually very useful. So the complete map is often useless. So if it's a complex text, the complete map is so complex, you know, the realist novel, forget it, it's just like a ball of wool, literally. If you look on the site, you'll see that. Like Oliver Twist, it's just like, you can see the odd thing, but it's just like a massive ball of wool. So the secondary maps, the topoi map is the most useful actually often. It will tell you the most information quickly, which is privileging the places over the chronotopes. So you're looking at different maps and going, okay, what information do I want? So there's a there is a bit of sleight of hand there in the critical arguments that I'll fess up to, where I choose the maps that work to make the argument. I don't necessarily use all the maps in all the series every time. The bottom map is also a really useful map. It's the simplest map, and I'll show it to you. It tells you what percentage of the text is given to what chronotope. So that's quite interesting, like which spatiotemporal type is actually the dominant model for this text. So I guess the other thing to say about the complete map is it doesn't matter if it's sort of useless in a way because you've got the other maps, but also sometimes the complete map tells you, right, I need to make a secondary series. So it's all about, so this is where you probably like it because it sounds like you're sort of learning through doing. That's what we learned through doing it. We're like, okay, the maps are just a process. The maps are part of a process. You make one lot of maps, you read them, you think about them in relation to X, think, well, what do I need? Actually, I need a secondary set that shows me something else. So since we're focusing on Peter Pan, I just show you that a complete series for one version of Peter Pan, the final version of the play. So that's the complete map. It's quite readable, actually. I mean, you can't read it from there, but it's showing you the different spaces, the nursery, the Neverland. Can't see what they are, but it's quite clear. The topoi map we're going to come back to later. Very distinct spaces of nursery and Neverland. The chronotopes there. This shows how the places and the chronotopes are connected. So that's quite an interesting map because it can look very different with different texts. Sometimes it's like real snowflakes everywhere, and sometimes it's very connected. So it means, did the chronotope stay as the same? Was a castle always a castle? Did it start as a castle? They were trapped there, but then they fell in love. It became an idyll. So the chronotope can change. It's also really, really useful, I think, and really interesting. It can change its identity across the text. Deep chronotope map, we're going to come back to that. And yeah, I'm not going to worry about Sujet and Fabula today. If anyone wants to ask me, do so later. Okay, that was your whistle-stop tour. So you have a rough idea of what you're looking at. And I'm now going to read for the rest of the paper. So, of course, these maps that I've been showing you are really graph topologies that function as maps in relation to the text from which they are generated. So if we're to develop a spatial approach to digital literary mapping, it's worth thinking a bit more about the potential of literary topology. Topology concerns a geometric object that has a continuous form and can be deformed into other shapes while still preserving its internal properties. Famous example, Mobius strip. Topology is therefore fundamentally concerned with three properties: connectivity, relationality, and dimensionality. From a literary cartographic perspective, topological graphs, which is what the maps are, releases us into a model of relative rather than absolute mapping of different aspects of literary space and place. So the topology is allowing us not to map to the real, but to explore the internal dynamics of the text. Now you can still layer it on. I don't have an example of that today, but we did do that in the project. So you can still shape, you could generate the relative map and layer it onto the real. And actually one thing, at the start of the project I was very like relative mapping, not absolute, throw it out altogether. And I have totally changed my position now. So again, this fits with you guys in that actually the more different ways you map, the more useful it is. So I would say relative mapping has its uses in some ways, and absolute mapping has its uses in other ways. So I've come to a more moderate position actually through doing it. So there are actually kind of standard accounts of topological form. And so you have like 4 basic forms: mesh, star, ring, bus. And then you have these sort of hybrids, various hybrids that are kind of combination, subcategory from those. What we found when we started generating the maps was key shapes would like jump out and be like, oh, that's very distinctive. You know? So then I was starting to think, my whole purpose as the lead on the project was to come up with an interpretive method, which was super stressful, I have to say, because I didn't know if I could do that. So I was looking at these things, like, there must be something in that. What are these actually? What are these forms? Well, in a sense, they are, the topology is the underlying spatial form of that text. I mean, that is what it is, literally. So that can work in 2 ways, using the topologies, reading the spatial meaning, that we would not be aware of unless we had the visualization. So you can use it in a Franco Moretti kind of way, which is, da-da, you know, here's my map, da-da, did I impress you? So we do have the odd example of that. And the most striking is for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a great medieval text, English text. Within the narrative, Gawain prides himself on being the perfect knight. He's a model of exactness, balance, and perfection, and this determines his whole behavior and his internalized standards of chivalry. This sense of perfection is explicitly symbolized in the poem on his shield, which you can see here, by the symbol of the pentangle. It says, 5 things which meant more to Gawain than to most other men. So these 5 sets of 5 were fixed in this night, each linked to the last through the endless line, a 5-pointed form which never failed, never strong to one side or slack at the other, but unbroken in its being from beginning to end. So actually what's interesting here is the medieval text, that is a topological form. I mean, that's what it's describing, isn't it? It's using the idea of the topology already. And that's why Gawain adopts it as his symbol, because he wants this sense of himself as perfect. And of course, in the poem, you know, he's tested and he fails to meet that perfection. So when we generated the deep chronotopic map for Gawain, we found a kind of loose pentangle at the heart of that map. Which is, you know, that is very pleasing, I have to say. I was like, wow, that is just fantastic. What does that mean? I don't know. I mean, does it mean that at some deep level, the symbolism of the surface is somehow embedded in the form? I don't know. Is that possible? I wouldn't swear to that. And again, being completely honest with you, quite a few of the deep chronotopic maps do have a pentangle. So it's not a unique pentangle, but still, it's a poem about the pentangle in which there's a pentangle as the core structure. So at those points, you get these really nice kind of synergies, I guess, between the spatial form and the meaning, and you can play off with that in various ways. So those are your kind of impressive moments, I guess. Far more commonly, though, and much more interestingly for me, the power of the model, I think, is comparative. So again, this is where it's relevant to you guys. It lies in uncovering particular spatial forms for particular genres or literary types. So again, we couldn't do that. We didn't do that because we were scoping out projects, so we didn't have the capacity to do that. But ideally, what you'd have done, you know, follow-up bid, you could say, right, let's take the ballad. So we did a couple of ballads, and we saw, the ballad is often a figure of 8, for example. So, you know, ideally, you'd take 100 ballads and go, are all ballads, are 90% of ballads figures of 8? Who knows? We don't know, because no one's ever done this before. But maybe they are. I mean, it kind of makes sense. They're kind of an out and a return. So maybe they are. Maybe that is the spatial form of the ballad. So the maps are revealing things to you that you wouldn't otherwise know. And the other way that I find this very interesting is in terms of what I was talking about earlier, in terms of breaking free of, I guess, the sort of macro structures through which we analyze text. So if instead of sort of taking as a starting point, say genre or period, or genre really, if you started with the maps, the underlying spatial map, then you find, okay, certain texts produce certain forms. So Frankenstein, there's a big ring topology at the heart of it, which is Victor's root, actually. And War of the Worlds, you also have these big loops, 2 big loops. So these are not 2 texts that we would commonly read together. We wouldn't normally put Frankenstein anywhere near War of the Worlds. They're in different periods, they're by different authors, they don't really seem to have anything in common. But I'm looking thinking, well, they do, I know they do, because I have a spatial map in front of me that shows me they have something in common. So I start thinking, okay, well, do they? Well, let's see, this text, why is there a loop? Because Victor is supposedly going on a touristic, voyage around Europe, but actually being driven by the creature because he's got to go and make him a mate up in the Orkney Isles off that little triangle off there. And in War of the Worlds, why is there a massive loop? Because the narrator and his brother are fleeing Martian invaders who have dropped to Earth and they're trying to get away from them. So actually, they're very similar. Their spatial form is very similar. And not the spatiality of the narrator is extremely similar. He's being driven, he's not freely moving, he's being driven by an alien force that is forcing him outside his comfort zone. So, that's just a good example, just to even superficially, you go, oh, actually they are really interesting to read against each other. Second example, the kite. So very unusual. Hardly, I think these are the only 2 texts that we did that had a kite. I wasn't expecting a kite at all, hadn't even thought of it. It's like, oh, there's a kite, what's happening? Well, what is happening? In Utopia, you have a real world, you can see that with the purple lines, and you have another world that is being played off against it as an ideal. And in Peter Pan, you have the safe adult world of the nursery, and you have the increasingly threatening world of Neverland. So again, once you stop and think about it, you're like, well, actually, these 2 texts have lots in common, really a lot in common, and you could read them together. So in a way, it depends how far you want to go with that. But if we lay aside generic presuppositions and focus purely on the underlying spatial form of the text, this is potentially giving you an entirely new way of reading literature, really. So that's quite exciting. At least I fulfilled my role. That's the main thing. So what does this mean, I guess, for literary mapping? In my view, it means that the mapping always has to be iterative. It has to kind of move between verbal and visual forms. Good understanding of the text, generation of the map, analysis of the maps, further secondary maps or comparative, like I say, across a whole form, across texts that flag out that they have the same underlying form and so on. It's very much about a mapping of part and whole as well, which I think is quite interesting, and scaling up and scaling down. So this is the other thing we realised in the project, couldn't really allow for it enough. But yeah, you've got to be able to, of course you could have sub-maps, you could map your whole text, but then you could have maps for distinct chapters, and then you see something very different. For Frankenstein, actually the whole map, which I don't think I've got there, you have Victor's loop, and then you have Walton going off like a kind of crack up there, and then you have the creature. And the minute I looked at that map, I was like, oh, well, we've got to make a secondary map because there's 3 narratives here, and they're actually all very different. So then you do a secondary map, and you get more information out of that. So in a way, the first map series is just pointing towards, well, what do I actually want to map? What's actually interesting? It's not in and of itself meaningful. The other thing that emerges is by making the maps, you start to think about different ways in which you are experiencing that space. And often texts that are most interesting, there's a tension between those different ways within the text that it draws your attention to. And we'll see that in Peter Pan in a minute. Obviously, comparative mapping of forms, comparative mapping of different versions of text, which is what we're going to look at in a minute. Micro mapping, I'd quite like to have done. We didn't really do that, like really intensely using the model. And ultimately, it's pointing towards the need for a dynamic model, actually, which again, we didn't do at this stage, but obviously the follow-up bid, I put in a massive follow-up bid, which I haven't got the funding for, to make a dynamic model. Okay, so final part. Going to focus in now on Peter Pan and think about this idea of a processual method in which the maps are not kind of ultimate authorities giving you a position, but part of this process, part of a process of reading and mapping. In her powerful critique of children's literature, The Case of Peter Pan, or The Impossibility of Children's Fiction, Jacqueline Rose reminds us that J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan was retold before he had written it and rewritten after he had told it. And what she's referring to here is the fact that Peter Pan occurs in multiple textual versions. So I'm just going to talk these through and try and bear them in mind. So in 1902, the first version is in a very odd little book called The Little White Bird. It's a book for adults, one of these sort of weird, whimsical, slightly uneasy books that are around at the turn of the 20th century. And Peter Pan is just a little story within that. 1904, there's a play. The play's put on of Peter Pan. Very, very rushed, very informal. They have to delay the opening. Should have been before Christmas, for Christmas. He's writing it like Shakespeare, sort of in different parts. So it's not published, but it is put on in a play form. 1906, he takes out those earlier chapters from The Little White Bird and he publishes them as their own thing. In a way, this is like the first full version, if you like, Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. 1911, what is probably the standard text. If you read Peter Pan, this is probably what you're reading, Peter and Wendy, prose version. And finally, 1928 play version that is quite different, quite revised actually from the earlier version, but it's finally published in 1928. So you've got multiple texts and different forms as well. So if the story of Peter Pan is multiple and textually unstable, this is also true authorially, as Barrie repeatedly and publicly asserted a model of multiple co-authorship between himself and others, as well as between adult and child. In his dedication to the 1928 play script, for the 5 Llewellyn Davis boys to whom and with whom he first made up the stories, Barrie states, "I have no recollection of writing the play of Peter Pan." Extraordinary statement, really. "You had played it until you tired of it, and tossed it in the air and gored it, and left it derelict in the mud, and went on your way singing other songs. And I then stole back and sewed some of the gory fragments together with a pen nib. Any one of you 5 brothers has a better claim to the authorship than most, and I would not fight you for it." So Peter Pan is a composite text, and one that seems to glory in its own multiplicity and the way in which it morphs across versions and forms. But what we know to be true of texts is also true for maps of texts. Both exist in a state of becoming, and this allows for the two to be aligned in the kind of interpretive model I'm proposing. In the field of cartography, interpretation of maps has moved from a traditional view that maps represent objective information truthfully to a much more sceptical position by means of critical cartography, itself informed by literary theory. In a post-representational approach, the map is not viewed primarily as a representation of place coming after, but as an active creator of spaces. And Rob Kitchen is a really key person here. He has some really good papers on this. So he says, a map does not simply represent the world, it produces the world. Out of this, following from this then, emerges a kind of processual approach for mapping, which values maps as dynamic and fluid, and focuses on what they do rather than on what they represent. From this perspective, a kind of key quotation from Kitchen, here, maps rather are understood as always in a state of becoming, as always mapping, as simultaneously being produced and consumed, authored and read, designed and used, serving as a representation and practice, as mutually constituting map space in a dyadic relationship. So a processual mapping method is inherently subjective and inherently dynamic, valuing the ways in which forms and meanings change over time. the definition of such acts of mapping as spatial practices enacted to solve relational problems could be taken as a definition of the work we sought to undertake for literature. Such a position dovetails with the work of Johanna Drucker in the field of digital humanities, who makes a strong case for the need to reclaim visualization tools. She says, the majority of information graphics are shaped by the disciplines from which they have sprung, statistic, empirical sciences, and business. Can these graphic languages serve humanistic fields where interpretation, ambiguity, inference, and qualitative judgment take priority over quantitative statements and presentations of fact? Focusing on the way information is presented, she sets out to consider how to serve a humanistic agenda by thinking about ways to visualize interpretation. And she makes a crucial distinction, which is in play really in my earlier sort of dig at Moretti, between two kinds of map. Those that are, as she says here, that are representations of information already known, so they're just illustrative, and those that are knowledge generators, capable of creating new information through their use. So this is really useful. For me, this is a really useful distinction, because I was like, okay, that is the difference between what Moretti's doing and what I'm doing, actually, is how we're using the maps and how we view the maps. So we'll try and put that into practice today by returning to Peter Pan and working comparatively across both maps and texts. We can begin by comparing two very different maps for Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, the earliest kind of full single version of it. So in the first edition, 1906, Arthur Rackham, who's a famous illustrator, gives this very nice plan of Kensington Gardens. And the map on the right is the topological map generated out of the coded text for Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. Again, this used to happen to me all the time when I used to work on manuscripts. I always find these extraordinary coincidences. It's like a kind of fairy, it's like it's sort of winged shape, and obviously that's just a mad coincidence, isn't it? But still, great. Okay, so two very different ways of mapping the text. And what we see in the text itself is that Kensington Gardens is a very sheltered, risk-averse place, strongly demarcated by the adults. So it says, the gardens are bounded on one side by a never-ending line of omnibuses, over which your nurse has such authority that if she holds up her finger to any one of them, it stops immediately. She then crosses with you in safety to the other side. The well-known spatial distinction between map and tour is strongly in play here, but the tour mode is so emphatically applied that it becomes a highly controlling trope for both character and reader. Narrative voice is strongly linked to spatiality and to the contained nature of spatial experience for the child by the adult guide. At times, the actions of the child seem almost predetermined by the use of the second person. Let's get the second quotation. You can't be good all the time at the round pond, however much you try. You can be good in the broad walk all the time, but not at the round pond. And the reason is that you forget. And when you remember, you're so wet that you may as well be wetter. So if we look back at Rackham's illustration map, you can see this. He emphasizes the boundedness very strongly, actually, both with the outer frame, but also the broad walk and the fences and so on. So you get this very strong sense of a contained space. So let's go back to that. What we find repeatedly in using topological maps to analyse spatial meaning is that they draw attention to tensions between different ways of experiencing and representing place and space. Unsurprisingly, in a work such as Peter Pan, that tension is primarily centred on the difference between the adult's and the child's spatial experience. The adult seeks to protect the child and thus to create a safely contained space. However, in this first version, Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, the figure of the child, there's a boy in the book that the narrator's talking to who's called David, and then there's the story of Peter Pan. And Peter Pan is obviously an alter ego to this very compliant. So you have this very compliant, controlled child, and then you have Peter Pan, messing everything up. So the first child conforms and accepts the model, the second seeks to transgress. In the relative topological map, the topoi map generated from the text, we can see the same locations are actually privileged as in Rackham's version, so it's hard for you to see that, but it says like the broad walk at the top, the round pond, the serpentine in the middle, all these key sites within the park. But the relative map also registers the discrete space of the fairies, which is at the bottom, sort of orange, and the island in the serpentine at the top. So you get these, where you've got the purple, remember, which is the actual place, which in this case is very much the adult place. And then the orange is sort of jumping out from that, fairies there, and Peter Pan himself at the top right in orange. So the distinction between adult and child now also correlates to one between realist places, able to be named and directly visited, and imaginary or fantastical ones. In fact, if we look back to Rackham's map, so just off that side there, I'm just going to give you detail from that now. We see that he does also cleverly register this spatial distinction, with the river flowing off the map and the island, which is Peter Pan's island, hanging in suspended non-representational space. And if we return from this to the text, we find that this indeterminate open space is registered within it, but it's easy to miss. So he says, a small part only of the serpentine is in the gardens, for soon it passes beneath a bridge to far away, where the island is, on which all the birds are born that become baby boys and girls. Here, the mention of far away, almost in passing, is the first gesturing towards Neverland, which doesn't exist at all in this earlier version. So the island in the Serpentine is both a deeply contained, nested site within the park, but it's also threatening to escape, spill over into another kind of space, as of course it will do in the next version of the text. If we compare the Topoi map for Peter Pan and Kensington Gardens with the Deep Chronotope map for the same text, this shows a far greater equality between imagined child space and realist adult for the text as a whole. So the purple lines represent direct movement in the world, and the dominant chronotopes are encounter and road, as the adult narrator takes a turn around the park, social space of the park, and this is registered in the chronotope of the public square. But also with castle figuring strongly, so it's both an adult, nice safe space for the adults, but it's also potentially sort of, suppressing, repressing the children. The mesh topology, in this case, creates a different kind of nest in which real adult and imagined child are tightly interconnected, but with a sense of the imaginary space pulling away from the real, as if one is evolving out of the other. As well as comparing map visualizations for the same text, as we're doing here, we can also compare the same map across different versions of the text. So if we turn to the deep chronotopic map of the play, the later play, we find the kite form discussed earlier, in which the two worlds are increasingly equal to each other. So you can see, so here what you're seeing then is how the chronotopic space is evolving across the different versions of the play. Oh, not the play, the text. So now, in the kite, this is the last version, this is the first version, this is the last version of the text. Now there's a much more layering of space as the real is partly supplanted by the fictional. So right at the heart of the kite is parlour, which is a kind of internal space, and in Peter Pan that's the nursery is a parlour, and so is the home underground where the Lost Boys live. And so what starts to happen here is that those two spaces are now overlain, and there's a sense in which the I'll Be Mother play of Wendy in Neverland threatens to displace the real world altogether. So here they're kind of harmonious, but one sort of, the imaginary space is kind of pulling away, but now the imaginary space is threatening to overwhelm and replace the real. And you could use the topograph here. You can look more closely at the topographs, which show you this kind of interplay between the two spaces. So you've got spaces. The parlour is both on the island and in the real world, and the place names are kind of showing you that directly and indirectly. So finally, you can go further and read the same map across all three texts, the main text, to see the spatial evolution more clearly. So the most dramatic maps, this is the Topoi map across all three. We've seen that one already. What we see then across the plays, as Neverland emerges, is an increasing distinction between the worlds, and so the child's space is starting to kind of overtake the adults. Instead of one space being safely contained within another, very contained, or at least anchored to it, as it was in Peter Pan and Kensington Gardens, the two worlds start to kind of come apart here. You can see Peter's home, number 14, it's kind of pulling apart, and then in the final map, the only linkage there is the meta text of the in the play. So it's a play, you have to bear that in mind, which means, you know, that the sites are likely to be more separated, I guess, in each act, for example. But yeah, the only actual direct link now is the authorial comments in the margins, as it were. In the example of Peter Pan, then, the digital maps draw out and emphasize a core spatial tension present in the text itself, but also one which develops and unfolds across the totality. Spatial enlargement from the real setting of Kensington Gardens to Neverland is also a shift across forms that gradually gives more and more power to the spatio-temporality of Peter himself, who is no longer anchored in the real and becomes increasingly threatening as a result. Not only that, but the imaginary space itself becomes multiple and layered. And this sense of a layered shifting space in which one morphs into another is exactly what the narrator seems to describe in the fullest account of Neverland given in Peter and Wendy. So it's quite a long text. That's just showing you the separation of the spaces there. It is quite a long text, but it's great, so I'm going to read it out. I don't know whether you've ever seen a map of a person's mind. Doctors sometimes draw maps of other parts of you, and your own map can become intensely interesting, but catch them trying to draw a map of a child's mind, which is not only confused, but keeps going round all the time. There are zigzag lines on it, just like your temperature on a card, and these are probably roads in the island. For the Neverland is always more or less an island, with astonishing splashes of colour here and there, and coral reefs and rakish-looking craft in the offing, and savages and lonely lairs, and gnomes who are mostly tailors, and caves through which a river runs, and princes with 6 elder brothers, and a hut fast going to decay, and one very small old lady with a hooked nose. It would be an easy map if that were all. But there is also first day at school, religion, fathers, the round pond, needlework, murders, hangings, verbs that take the dative, chocolate pudding day, getting into braces, say 99 threepence for pulling out your tooth yourself, and so on. And either these are part of the island, or they are another map showing through. And it is all rather confusing, especially as nothing will stand still. Of course, the Netherlands vary a good deal. John's, for instance, had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, at which John was shooting, while Michael, who was very small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands, Michael in a wigwam, Wendy in a house of leaves, deftly sewn together. John had no friends, Michael had friends at night, Wendy had a pet wolf forsaken by its parents, but on the whole, the Neverlands have a family resemblance, and if they stood still in a row, you could say of them that they have each other's nose, and so forth. So the narrator here sort of is, well, he's kind of describing a cognitive map, obviously, kind of literally the child's imagination, but also creating a kind of a totally impossible space which cannot be represented in any way. Ultimately, such a space is disturbing to both adult and child, precisely because it is an exact inversion of the safe and contained area of the park, with its bounds of space and time from which it emerged originally. Play is only definable as play because it ends. The park gates close at the end of the day. So a place of permanent play is an impossible paradox. There is a sense in which Peter's world is neither that of the adult nor that of the child, as this spatial tug-of-war suggests, but increasingly somewhere that nobody really wants to inhabit permanently, at least not even Peter. So, in conclusion, my conclusion is not really a conclusion so much as a pause for reflection. The Chronotopic Cartographies project was always a proof of concept project, an attempt to play with new ways of working digitally with text as maps. It throws up as many questions as it answers. For example, the identification and marking up of chronotopes introduces a high level of subjectivity into the process which bears upon the maps. As originally created, the project is manual, not automated, and this is an area one could explore much further, potentially integrating the two or evaluating the merits of one approach against the other. Even more pertinently to my mind, the topological model lends itself to being made dynamic and to moving from 2D into a 3D model, in which visualizations could morph over time and across different spatial states within a work or across different versions. And I've played around with this, but they wouldn't give me the money. But I have a great guy, Andrew Richardson, at Northumbria, who I've worked with quite closely, and he took the 2D maps and made a 3D dynamic version, basically, in which you move through as you move through the text, the landscape goes with it. And then he and I took this model and linked it to a scale of affect, so you could map each character, so that height is joy and depth is, despair on our scale, whatever it was. So you'd end up with you literally, go up and down as the character across the text goes up and down, which I thought was quite an interesting thing to do. So I want to end simply by saying that this is not the end. There is still much work to be done. Thank you very much.